Good morning, students. Today we will begin with the poem titled Background Casually by Nissim Ezekiel. The poem Background Casually tells about the struggle of the poet for identity, where he, as well as his community, that is, Jews, they were considered as aliens. This is yet another well known poem written by Nissim Ezekiel, which was published in 1965, later collected in Hymns in Darkness. This is a long narrative which contains 75 lines and it is divided into three parts. And it is very important because this poem is considered as the poetic autobiography of Nissim Ezekiel. But unlike you see in Wordsworth's Prelude, there is no claim to high seriousness here. He is giving out a casual description about his background, and the title itself suggests that he wishes to be rather casual about his background. The poem is divided into three sections. The first part he talks about the childhood, second part he describes his adult age, and the last part about his old age. Let us begin the first section, which deals with the childhood of the poet. These are the lines. A poet, rascal, clown was born, the frightened child who wouldn't sleep, or eat or sleep, a boy of meager born. He never learned to fly a kite. His borrowed top refused to spin. So, in the first line itself, we understand the major theme of the poem being identity crisis. He has this self perception of being a poet. Then he adds two more part of his identity as a clown and as a rascal, a rogue. So here he uses this third person and he talks about his early phase, that is when he was born. He says he was born into a low family, and being a member of this alien community, that is Jewish community, he could neither eat nor could sleep and thus became quite weak. And due to this feeling of being low, he couldn't even fly a kite. And his borrowed top, he never had this money to buy a top, he borrowed a top which refused to spin. So there is this image of failure in the first stanza itself, a failure to give out a concrete identity for himself. Being part of this alien community, he was treated as the other, and he was weak in all respects. He didn't enjoy all those usual boyish sports like flying a kite, spinning a top, etc. He never knew the technique of spinning a top. So there was nothing noble in his birth. He talks about all those things he couldn't do, the things in which he failed. So here itself we understand that the poet is going through a crisis. The next part, he says, went to Roman Catholic school, a mugging Jew among the wolves. They told me I had killed the Christ. That year I won the scripture prize. A Muslim sportsman boxed my ears. I grew in terror of the strong but undernourished Hindu lads, their prepositions always wrong, repelled me by passivity. One noisy day I used a knife. In this stanza, the poet describes his childhood by using the first person. He says he was sent to a Roman Catholic school where, according to him, he was something like a prey to all those wolves. This reference to all those Hindus and Muslims. So he was always alien to all other religions. Even Christian community, which was a minority but still a prominent minority in India, treated Jews as the other. So he was a mugging Jew among the wolves, and he says that he was often ridiculed by Hindus and Muslims who accused him of this murder of Christ. So you know this reference to Bible. And Jews were always treated as villains. Always treated as villains, as for example, you see in the plays of William Shakespeare, Jews were treated as villains. For example, Sherlock. Sherlock, Shylock in William Wordsworth's play. He's a Jew. And all those atrocities against Jew during the Nazi rule. So you remember Jews were treated as they were going through this trauma of because of their community. So here he gives out this traumatic experience as a Jew going to a Roman Catholic school in Bombay. And here there is a clear indication that there was this religious and cultural alienation which he had to experience growing up as a member of this minority community. And he says the same year he won the scripture prize, depicting that, which gives out the idea that he was good in schooling. That was an irony. A Jew winning the scripture prize, a prize he wins for the something like a quiz based on scriptures. And later he says that he was often beaten by a Muslim boy. And this terror always reigned in his mind during that stage, during his childhood. He grew up in terror of all those strong but undernourished Hindu lads. Terror reigned in his mind, and being enraged, he even thought of becoming violent. He says that one noisy day I used a knife. So he presents completely a hostile atmosphere, and even then we understand that he proclaims his love for language here. He says that undernourished Hindu lads, their prepositions always wrong. So here he proclaims his love for language, his sensitive reaction to bad English. So he continues, he was repelled me by passivity. Passivity is the state of accepting what happens without reacting, without fighting against it. So here the poet is trying to give out, generally overall, the poet is trying to portray his uneasy relationship with India, which is his home, due to the traumatic experience he had to go through from from other communities. He says that not only Muslims but Hindu boys also repelled him with their wrong accent and use of language, and sometimes at some point of times he even thought of becoming violent, and once he used his knife, and though he doesn't mention where, how and why he used this knife. He continues, at home on Friday nights the prayers were said. My morals had declined. I heard of yoga and of Zen. Could I perhaps be Ravi's saint? The more I searched, the less I found. So he says, at home he heard prayers that at that point of time he understood that even the gods are not dependable. His morals declined. He understood that he is not morally so good, and he even heard of other streams of yoga other religious streams like of yoga, of Zen. Zen is something like a Japanese form of Buddhism. And he asks questions. Could I perhaps be Ravi saint? The more I searched, the less I found. So he is curious to find an answer. But he says the more deeper he went, the more confused he was. So we see that he becomes more and more skeptical. We see an enduring skepticism which marks his poetry in these lines. He gives out the incoherence, he presents the incoherence of his identity. Unable to fix an identity is present there. Even within his community, he can't find a consolation or an answer. He finds his own religion meaningless and the other religions attacking him as a group of wolves. Now we come to the second part of the poem. Here he talks about his adult age experiences. These are the lines. 22, time to go abroad. First the decision, then a friend to pay the fare. Philosophy, poverty and poetry. Three companions shared my basement room. So he says his family desired to send him to England for higher studies, but financially, as he quoted in the first stanza itself, they were financially poor, so they couldn't afford his expenses. And one of his friends helped him to pay the fare to go to England. And there too he was alone, and the only company he had were three P's. One is philosophy, poetry, and poverty were his friends. So here he describes the incident of going to foreign nation to study, and he describes how other people helped him to go there. The London seasons passed me by. I lay in bed 2 years alone, and then a woman came to tell my willing ears I was the son of man. I knew that I had failed in everything, a bitter thought. So, in an English cargo ship, taking French guns and mortar shells to Indochina, scrubbed the decks and learned to laugh again at home. So he continues. Time passed, and even after 2 years, he was alone. And then a woman came and tried to motivate him, saying that he was the son of man, trying to motivate him. And hence he tried to make his life a little better. But later, he understood that he recognizes his failure and it becomes an unbearable thought for him. He says, I knew that I had failed in everything, though there are different people who tried to help him, and there is this woman who was trying to motivate him. He had this constant thought of being a failure, a bitter thought. And he started working on a cargo ship that took French guns and mortar shells to India and China. And he was finally able to go back to India on the same ship. So here itself, he worked in an English cargo ship taking French guns and mortar shells to Indochina. So here itself, we understand that there is this recurrent theme of fluid identity comes into the fore. That is the crux of the poem, the identity crisis. A Jewish person working in an English cargo ship which takes French guns to India and China. So the recurrent theme of identity crisis is His inability to discover himself because of this fluid identity is, is, is visible in all these lines. So he talks about his academic career. In these lines, he talks about his academic career, which was not at all successful, and he returns home by scrubbing decks to earn his passage. He continues, how to feel at home was the point. Some reading had been done, but what had I observed except my own exasperation? All Hindus are like that, my father used to say, when someone talked too loudly or knocked at the door like the devil. They hopped and spat, they sprawled around. I prepared for the worst, married, changed jobs, and saw myself a fool. The song of my experience sung, I knew that all was yet to sing. My ancestors among the caste were aliens crushing seed for bread. The hooded bullock made his rounds. So he returns back home, and after coming back to India, he tried to be happy and tried to feel at home again, but still he felt like he was still an alien. How to feel at home was the point. So he was constantly looking for the answer of how to feel at home. He never felt like India being a home to them. And he says, some reading had been done, but what had I observed except my own exasperation? He was going through, he was so irritated. He did all those reading, he tried to do all those research in his mind to find a stable identity, but he becomes completely annoyed. Exasperation is being a state of being irritated or annoyed. And his father used to say that all Hindus are like that all Hindus are violent. This family of Nissim Ezekiel was going through this humiliation from their neighbors, mainly Hindus and Muslims, and hence he prepared to endure the worst. He had these neighbors, Hindu neighbors, who talked too loudly, and he even irritated them by knocking at their door like devils. They hopped, they spat. So, never ever he felt at home. As a Jew, he always felt as an alien in India. And even when he went abroad, that crisis continued. Not being able to fix an identity, not being able to find a stable identity. And then later he married, he changed job. So these are the ways he is trying to find an identity for himself. Different ways. He got married, he changed his job, and at the end he saw himself as a fool. He saw himself as a fool because he was going through all those, he was trying to fix an identity and he fails, and later he recognizes his foolishness. So the sense of otherness is the sense of being treated as the other, being alien is the crux of the poem. And then he talks about his ancestors. He says, the song of my experience sung, I knew that all was yet to sing. So here the reference is to Blake's songs of experience. So here he says that he had this set of experiences which is mainly predominantly traumatic, and it provided lot of deeper insight. But he says there is a lot more to come. And then he talks about his ancestors, my ancestors among the caste were aliens. So even in Jewish community, you should know that even in Jewish community which settled in Bombay, there were two communities. One was Baghdad is Jewish people, and the other one is Beni Israel Jewish community. And Beni Israel Jewish community was considered low when compared to Baghdad Jewish people. So he belonged to this Beni Israel community, who were predominantly their vocation was crushing the seeds for oil. So he says, my ancestors among the caste were aliens crushing seed for bread. The hooded bullock made his rounds. So he says that even his ancestors were treated as aliens. He explains how low their community was. His ancestors did the job of crushing seeds, as I said earlier. It was not a good job. So even in their community, they were treated as the marginalized. And then we come to the third part, the last part, where he shares his experience as an old person. He says, one among them fought and taught, a major bearing British arms. He told my father sad stories of the Boer War. I dreamed that fierce men had bound my feet and hands. The later dreams were all of words. I did not know that words betray, but let the poems come and lost that grip on things the worldly prize. I would not suffer that again. So gradually we see that a sense of purpose unfolds. He reclaims the memories of his ancestors but really finds meaning in dream of words or in poetry. There is this Finally, there is this acceptance of responsibilities, an acceptance of one's limitations, and a kind of reconciliation happening even in this hostile environment, in a difficult environment. So here he explains his experience as an old person. He says that one of his friends told how he fought in the Boer War. And here writing poetry is also not safe, and even words can harm a person. He wrote poems, and it is through poems he purged his sufferings. And later he tried to write wisely without giving a kind of a free play to his thoughts. He expresses his inner and outer suffering that he ultimately failed to defeat. And he says that let the poems come and lost that grips on things the worldly prize, I would not suffer that again. So he says that now the poems come and he accepts it. He accepts his responsibilities, his limitations. Let the poem come and be lost. I would not suffer that again. So there is an element of reconciliation here. He first firstly he brings about all this frustration, all his anguish when he started his vocation as a poet. He failed. He says that he failed. He says that his words betrayed him initially. But later, he says, let them come and be lost. I don't mind words betraying me. Let it grip on me. Let it give a worldly prize, and I would not suffer that again. And then he comes to a resolution. He says, I look about me now and try to formulate a plainer view. The wise survive and serve, to play the fool, to cash in on the inner and outer storms. The Indian landscape sears my eyes. I have become a part of it, to be observed by foreigners. They say that I am singular. Their letters overstate the case. I have made my commitments now. This is one, to stay where I am, as others choose to give themselves in some remote and backward place. My backward place is where I am. So here he says he has become more wiser. Wiser. There is We feel that a clarity emerges finally. He says, I look about me now and try to formulate a simple view of myself, a plainer view. He says that I will make best use of all those opportunities. I will cash in on my inner and outer storms. So he says that even though the Indian landscape burns his eyes, he says, I have become part of it. I have become an integral part of it. And though all these foreigners say that I am singular, I am, I am a kind of odd one out. I feel like I have become part of India, and I have decided to make my commitment that I am here to stay, as other choose to give themselves in some remote backward place. And my backward place is where I am. So he says that he concludes by saying that he is determined to stay here. He finds a kind of a deep commitment. He finds some kind of satisfaction even in that limited ambition. So here he probes this question of identity, and in the final part he fixes it firm in a social context. Though his identity is completely in a fluid state, he says that he had made his commitment. Though it is a backward place, he realizes that he belongs to this place, and he decides to give himself completely to this place. And this realization gives him a kind of a peace of mind. So he says, my backward place is where I am. So this poem is something which provide the poet a therapeutic energy. It is a description of his personal life, which is very subjective, and he is being introspective and self-analytical at the same time. He is examining in these three sections, he is examining with a kind of, I should say that with a kind of ironic detachment, he examined three phases of his life: early life, schooling, and then second part he talks about his adult life, and third part as an old person. So the first two sections focus on the poet's background, with which is full of irony. So you know that it is typical of Ezekiel's poetry, the use of irony. And in the third section, which is marked by this transition from the skeptical but relaxed narration of a past to a troubled confrontation with the present, and we see a kind of a awkwardness of providing commitment. So here Ezekiel was basically describing his identity crisis, but there are points which makes him different from other diasporic writers who also dealt with the same theme of identity crisis. Here we find that the solution he comes up with, that is to stay here in this backward place, is where I am. That resolution is rather instructive when compared to others. Many other diasporic writers have found themselves unable to commit themselves either to India or to their adopted country. While Ezekiel has made his commitments a kind of a deep commitment to this nation, though he never belonged to this nation, he says that I have made my commitment. I have he is in a state, he is has his determination to stay back, though he went through all those traumatic experiences. Here Ezekiel points to the opposite path of throwing in one's lot with one's immediate surroundings, even though the surroundings were hostile to him. But I should say that it is not for us to make all those judgments about which path is better of a group of diasporic writers who were unable to find a fixed route in India, or whether Nissim Ezekiel's path was good. I am not a person to give out a judgment of both paths. But here we have to observe the dynamics of each choices these diasporic writers make and the choice which Nissim Ezekiel has made. So here I stop my lecture. Please go through this poem once more and listen to this lecture. Thank you. Have a nice day.